everyone, Reverend Rex here, and welcome back to another video. Okay, so this is part 2 of my first Opium War by Extra History series, and today I'm going to be reacting to episode 3 and 4 of Extra History's first Opium War series. So, yeah, I'm saying series a lot. But anyway, like I said before in the part 1, I already know about the Opium War. I was taught about it in school, but we were only taught about what it was about and what's the purpose of it, and yeah. So anyway, let's get to it, shall we? Okay, 3, 2, 1, go.
Guns had been fired, lives had been lost, but full-scale war wasn't a certainty yet. The British set up a blockade. The Chinese were offering to let British captains dock so long as they signed a bond saying that they would never sell opium in China and were willing to be subject to Chinese law. But the British had already put out the order. No British ship was to trade with the Chinese. Tensions are high. Something would have to give. On the 3rd of November, 1839, a British ship by the name of the Royal Saxon approached Canton. They were signaled to stop, to turn back, but they made a run for it. One of the British ships in the blockade fired a warning shot. It skipped past their bow. The cannon shot was heard from the shore. The Chinese admiral stationed at Canton made his decision. He would send out his fleet to protect the Royal Saxons.
Okay, so let me get this straight. The British ship fired upon a fellow British ship, and now the Chinese admiral is sending ships to defend the ship on which the British ship shot at. This is confusing.
And so, a small host of junks and fireships began to pour out of the Canton harbor. The situation was confused. The commander of the ship that—
Wait a minute, fireship? They're still using fireships? I know that British military tactics and experience was a main factor of the British victory of the Opium Wars, but to think that the Chinese still used fireships, this just sad.
Originally fired, requested permission to engage. Captain Elliot, the superintendent of British trade and the man who'd convinced the British merchants to hand over their opium in the first place, initially wavered, but the Chinese ships were bearing down hard. Another request to engage was made. The Chinese ships were festooned with red flags, the color of war. The honor of his nation and his flag would not allow Elliot to back down before such intimidation. The order was given, and the men engaged. The first broadside roared over the water. British shells shredded one of the fire rafts. There was a cataclysmic explosion, a gout of flame and sea. One of the war junk's magazines had been hit. All that was left of it were burning planks carried by the waves. The ships turned to give another broadside, but the outmatched Chinese junks began to retreat. Only the proud admiral's flagship was left, standing defiantly, returning shot. But it was hopelessly outclassed and already damaged. Seeing the admiral standing alone, Elliot told his captains to cease fire. The point had been made, there was no need for meaningless slaughter. And so, seeing the ceasefire, the flagship turned and limped back to port. The first real battle—
This is why you don't challenge British naval power. They may not be the most powerful nation in the world ever since the decline of the empire, but still there's a reason why there's a song called Rule Britannia, Britannia Rule the Waves. Anyway, let's continue.
All of the Opium Wars had come and passed, with the British bombarding the Chinese forces for defending a British ship which they themselves had originally fired on.
Yep, it's confusing as hell. I couldn't even get it at first, but I somewhat understand.
Time after this, there was a lull. Some in China even thought that the British were too far away to seriously pursue a war.
And that's where they thought wrong.
But the truth was, the British were simply mustering their forces. At that very moment, Marines and soldiers from India were being redeployed and transported to China. The latest ships were dispatched from British naval yards to serve in the fight. Many in the British Admiralty saw this as an excellent opportunity to field test the iron, steam, and sail ships that were just rolling off the lines. When the forces arrived, though, the British descended on the island of Chusan. The Chinese and British officials met, once on the Chinese flagship, once on the British ship. Each time, the British made their demands clear: surrender the island and no one will be harmed. And each time, the Chinese responded in baffled disbelief. The Chinese officials told the British that, hey, we never did you any harm. It's not right to punish us for the acts of those in Canton. They implored the British to turn away, but the British had their duty, and as the Chinese officials made clear on their way out, so did they. The next morning, the bombardment began. Soon the Chinese forces retreated behind the walls of their city, and the British Marines landed unopposed. They set up their guns and then took the night to rest. By the next day, they found the city nearly deserted. Chusan had been captured with little loss of life, and the British had a jumping-off point for their operations should they decide to threaten Shanghai. By this point, the Emperor had dismissed Lin Zexu, the righteous minister who he had so celebrated a short while before, and replaced him with an official named Qishan, who was empowered to treat with the British. Qishan and Elliot began to discuss a settlement. They haggled over reparation for the destroyed opium, and eventually came to a figure of £6 million. But Elliot was still supposed to get territory for the British Empire that they could use for a port. He offered to return Chusan in exchange for some other island, but Qishan was not about to give away portions of sovereign China, and so the talks broke down. Then, as the new year passed, at least for the English, an opium runner, which had snuck its way into Canton, came back with the rumor that the Emperor intended to resume the war and attack the British. Elliot decided to preempt such an assault, though the wisdom of trusting unsubstantiated rumors...
Yeah, as we all know, best not to take the advice of someone who involves themselves in drugs.
Coming from opium runners is a bit questionable. Really, it's unlikely that such an attack was ever actually in the works. But working with the information he had, Elliot commanded the British forces to open fire on the Chinese fortifications at Chuanpi near Canton on the morning of January 7, 1841. The fighting lasted mere hours. The British guns ripped through the fortifications and silenced any counter-batteries with haste. Then, Indian and British Marines landed and rapidly pushed the Chinese ground forces back. Tragically, a rumor had been circulating among the Chinese that the British executed every prisoner they captured, and so many hopelessly fought on to the death, until their battalions were in tatters and their dead outnumbered their living. By 11 in the morning, the British flag flew over the Chinese battlements. 600 Chinese lay dead. A meager 100 were captured. Among the British, only 30 were wounded, and those not even from enemy fire, but because of their pieces of artillery overheating and exploding.
Wow. Just... no comment.
Meanwhile, the Nemesis, the iron steam and sail ship that was being tested in Chinese waters, demonstrated the power of its guns and rockets, dispatching junks and chasing away the Chinese fleet. 3 further forts stood to be captured, but the next morning, a Chinese physician came under flag of truce to ask on behalf of Qishan. Despite the overwhelming desire of the troops to cut their way to Canton, Elliot acquiesced. Horrified by the slaughter he had just witnessed, he wrote to one of the British trades who was pushing the war that he hoped to resolve it without further bloodshed, and that if further conflict was necessary, it was clear that they could take what they wanted. So he agreed to meet. Soon, terms were hammered out. The Chinese would pay $6 million in reparations. The British would pay $6 million to buy the island of Hong Kong. Ambassadors would be exchanged. The Chinese agreed to not call the British tribute-bearing barbarians anymore, and the British would return all the forts and the territory that they had taken during the war. And most importantly, trade would resume in a much more free and open manner. So, problem solved. The Chinese get just about the best terms they could conceivably hope for under the circumstances, and the British get to fulfill their mission and open up a whole new empire for trade. There's been some bloodshed, but in the end, everybody's happy, right? Well, not exactly. Elliot's boss back in England, a fellow named Lord Palmerston, who will undoubtedly crop up in other episodes down the line, was not happy. The British Empire didn't get the massive sum of money he wanted as reparations for the opium that was destroyed. They didn't get to keep the territory that they'd conquered. They didn't get as many open ports as he would like, and perhaps most of all, he was livid that Elliot, who had never really been comfortable with the drug trade in the first place, didn't even ask that opium be legalized in China. So, Elliot, for his swift and nearly bloodless execution of the war, was dismissed and sent packing.
Jeez. Elliot's a nice guy. Yeah. Honestly, that's all I can say.
And Qishan, the Emperor had to be ecstatic with these terms, right? I mean, the Chinese were clearly outmatched, and at the end of the day, all they had to cede was a barren rock in the middle of the ocean. Pretty good deal, right? Well, the Emperor was not so happy. In fact, he immediately recalled Qishan and ordered him executed for treason. Apparently, he thought they could have gotten a better deal. Don't worry, Qishan lived, he's fine, but needless to say, neither party ever signed this treaty. So join us next time as all the voices of reason are removed from the Opium War.
And we all know where this is going. Okay, let's move on to the final episode.
With all the moderate voices out of the picture, there are only two ways this conflict can now go. The Chinese can drive the British from their shores and clamp back down on
Highly unlikely.
trade with the outside world, or the British can bring this great empire to its
Most likely.
knees and force them to trade on their terms. There could be no other resolution. When the Chinese emperor dismissed Qishan, he summoned 3 men to replace him and take over the efforts against the British. One was his nephew, who would serve as the main commander. The other 2 were officials and military men. Before they left, one of the officials recommended that they accept peace and let the British busy themselves with trade while they modernized and strengthened the Chinese army. But the emperor would hear of no such thing. They would take back what had been lost. Chinese forces now massed around Canton. Elliot was still there. He had been trying, with almost no success, to limit the opium that flowed into the now British-controlled port. And the same official who had tried to reason with the emperor now reached out to him, hoping that the large numbers of fresh Chinese troops he brought in would give him more leverage at the bargaining table, and perhaps get Elliot to agree to an even better deal than he'd already offered. But this would not be the case, and so Elliot started concentrating British forces, telling the British and American merchants in Canton to withdraw. By the 22nd of May, 1841, the Chinese were shelling the British factories in town. In the night, they launched fire ships across the river at the becalmed British forces. The great steamship Nemesis fired up its engines, powering out of harm's way. The fire ships missed the rest of the fleet, sailing past and slamming into the port, setting the town on fire. A gun battle took place, but by dawn, the river was firmly in the hands of the British, and the fort guns the Chinese held were silenced. Now it was the British's turn to go on the offensive, but that offensive was halted by a Chinese plea for a truce. 2 days later, though, one of the Chinese commanders decided to break the truce. Desperation had set in. They launched manned fire ships to try to
Wait, what? Manned fire ships? How on earth do those even work? Do the men on board, like, steer them into the enemy ship? I doubt that will even give them a 10% chance of hitting.
destroy the British fleet, but even this would not avail them. In the end, the Chinese paid an indemnity to the British to not sack Canton, but riots by the peasants, looting by both the British and Chinese armies, and the complete lack of resolution on the matters of the opium, trade, and Hong Kong issues meant further conflict was inevitable. But as the British withdrew to regroup at Hong Kong, a typhoon hit. The cutter Elliot was on was smashed, leaving him swimming with the flotsam. He began swimming hard for Hong Kong when, over the horizon, he saw a sail. It wasn't a British sail, it was the battened sail of a Chinese...
Oh no. Is this how Elliot dies? Captured by the Chinese and are tortured or just executed? Please no. He's a nice guy.
He is war junk. He knew he had to swim for his life. Hong Kong was right in front of him. All he had to do was make it. Exhausted, he dragged himself onto
Oh, good. Good for him.
the shore, only to be greeted by the news that, actually, he was fired. He'd been fired 4 months ago. It was 1841.
Wow. This man gets shipwrecked by a typhoon, almost gets captured, swims for possibly kilometers, if not miles. Then once he finally gets on shore, he's been told he's been fired.
Getting news halfway around the world still took a while. and the men who
Oh yeah, I forgot. The telegram still wasn't invented by this time. I wonder when it was specifically invented. I'm gonna have to search that on Google later.
Placed Elliot were far less open to finding common ground with the Chinese. They were here to expand the rights of the British Empire by any means necessary. The war would no longer be interrupted by truces, ceasefires, and talks of peace. And thus the British began on their campaign north and east, capturing fortresses on their way. Each fortress wasn't just a victory in its own right, but a threat to the Emperor in Beijing. Each fallen citadel was another jumping-off point that the British now held, ever closer to the Chinese capital. And this time, there would be no returning land. There would be no giving back territory unless all British demands were met. These islands and fortresses the British captured would be held hostage, not to be relinquished as a sign of good faith or as a part of an agreement to reach a peace, but only in exchange for the ransom the government back in England demanded. As they took these fortresses, though, the British found a strange thing. Everywhere they went, next to the cannon, in the guard towers, they would find opium pipes. The Chinese resistance was weakened by the very drug they were...
Oh my god, not only were they underdeveloped in terms of military technology, but they were all... most of the military was high on drugs. No wonder they lost.
...supposed to be fighting against. From the officers all the way down to the enlisted men, much of the army was addicted to the drug. The British forces, on the other hand, were a mixture of discipline and severity. The new British commanders saw themselves as the civilized force in the conflict, and forbade looting on the pain of death, and even prevented their soldiers from cutting off captured prisoners' queues for trophies. But when one of their soldiers was kidnapped and beaten during a resupply mission, they had no problem burning several of the nearby villages in retaliation, as if they could train the population through punishment. As the winter of 1841 to 1842 passed into spring, and Chinese attacks became even more desperate, the retaliations simply became more brutal. But their advance pressed on. By the middle of June, Shanghai was taken, and then in July, Xinjiang, where we get a prelude of what's to come with the Manchu commander turning on the Chinese populace, illustrating the cultural and racial divides that would tear China apart over the next 60 years. After securing Xinjiang, the British finally moved on to Nanking. Both sides knew this would be the final showdown. The British wouldn't have to seize the capital at Beijing because Nanking stood at the entrance to the Yangtze, the river which was the heart of China. It was the superhighway down which all trade to the capital flowed. If Chinese access to the Yangtze could be cut off, the capital would starve, and much of the kingdom would be in chaos. So it all came down to this. It all came down to the capture of Nanking.
But they would never actually have a battle.
But there would be no great showdown, no final battle, because the Emperor finally began to realize that he was beaten, and that if they lost Nanking, there would be no negotiation, only surrender. So better to negotiate while he still could. He sent an official down to talk to the British. At first, talks went nowhere, as the British demanded that the official be given authority to make binding deals for his government, the lack of which the court in Beijing had taken advantage of in prior negotiations to get out of treaties made by other officials. Cultural misunderstandings and attempts to delay as long as possible by the Chinese officials delayed the process slightly further, but by the middle of August, under imminent threat of attack on the city, negotiations commenced. In the end, though, despite technically holding Nanking, it was clear who had all the leverage, whose gunboats could impose their will if negotiations failed, and the Chinese ended up conceding on nearly every point. The 6 million that Elliot had asked for now became 21 million, and the amount was granted. A number of new ports for trade were opened up. The old Kohong monopoly was abolished, and tariff rates were to be agreed upon rather than set by the sovereign Chinese government. The island of Hong Kong was ceded in perpetuity to the British, and British subjects would operate there under British law, completely free from Chinese jurisdiction, and British consulates were established at the treaty ports. The only two things that the Chinese didn't concede on were Christian missionaries, which were such a touchy subject that not even the British delegation tried to bring them up.
Wow. That's interesting. I didn't know that.
And opium. The Chinese government refused to legalize opium, even though the British representatives tried to lean on them to do so. Even though they had no power to prevent its sale, they steadfastly refused to legalize the drug. This would eventually lead directly to the Second Opium War, a conflict which plays out shockingly similarly to the first, at least in the broad strokes, but this time with most of the major colonial powers involved. These two wars, and the treaties which follow them, will go down in Chinese history as the unequal treaties, and begin what will later be labeled by the communist government as the Century of Humiliation. While at the time they may have seemed just a part of a larger destabilization and realignment of the country as a whole, they have since been seared into the Chinese consciousness, and to this day are conjured whenever dealings with the West take a turn for the worse. They are used as a milestone, a measuring marker for how far the country has come in the last 150 years, and as propaganda to remind everybody of that fact. And while these wars have perhaps the lowest casualty count of any of the conflicts that Extra History has covered to date, they have had a profound impact on global politics and global understanding all the way to today. The Opium Wars are long over, but their effects linger in significant ways. See you next time.
Okay, and that's the end of this reaction series. Wow, there are many details of the Opium War that really fascinated me, such as when the ship Elliot was on got shipwrecked, and yeah, there are many details which I didn't know because in school they just taught us, like I said before at the start of the video, they just taught us what the war was about, what it was for, what are the objectives, and you know, the time and dates of specific events. So yeah, they didn't really talk about figures such as Elliot and Shishan. So yeah, this was very interesting. And yep, that's all I have to say really. If you like this video, please hit the like and subscribe like I did with this video by Extra Credits. Go check them out. They make amazing content. Check out my Facebook page, link is in the description. And yeah, that's all I have to say. And I'll see you guys next time. Bye!